it's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much for the hospitality. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the host sponsors for making this lunch possible. I'm also very pleased to be here as well to recognize a very important chapter. I know that the Board of Trade is beginning a new chapter in this long and illustrious history here in the province of British Columbia. And I know that you've recently begun this new chapter by making a decision on bringing on board Ian Black as your new president and CEO. And I want to take a minute and congratulate you for that decision. Now, I first met Ian back in 2004. You may or may not know this, but his provincial district, and he served for 2 terms in my federal district, overlap each other. So I've known Ian now since 2004 for many years, and I had the pleasure of working with him on a number of projects, and I assure all of you who have been longtime newspayers and members of the Vancouver Board of Trade that Ian Black, if he brings anything like the degree of professionalism, dignity, responsibility, and hard work to the position of the Board of Trade that he brought as the MLA for Honourable Western, I assure you, the Vancouver Board of Trade will see many fantastic years ahead. Congratulations on your choice of Ian Black. So I thank you for the invitation because this is a very interesting time in Canada's economic story. Just over 3 years ago, as you of course know, the world economy was indeed in very dire straits. It's at a critical juncture in the downturn, the recession, in the final quarter of 2008. The finance ministers of the G7 countries, along with the central bank governors, got together in Washington, D.C. on Friday, October 10th, 2008. At that point, they created a 5-point plan, which was at a very critical time. As many of you will recall, on that weekend, that was the same weekend that Lehman Brothers had failed, and that Bear Stearns had failed just prior to that. Some German regional banks had failed, and there were bank failures in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't even clear that on the following Monday that the equity markets were even going to open. This was really DEFCON 5 of the global economy. The plan that they agreed to at that moment restored a degree of direction and confidence to the global economy. On November 2008, just a few weeks later, the G20, which represents 80% of the global economy, had made a decision to go ahead and create stimulus within our respective economies to ensure that our citizens were nowhere spared from the worst elements of the economic downturn. Moving forward from there, in Canada, our government created what we called the Economic Action Plan. It was a plan to deliver stimulus to the Canadian economy with the cooperation of Canada's provinces to protect Canadians from the worst consequences of a global recession. For British Columbians, we saw more investment into our province, more investment into British Columbia priorities and projects than at any other time before in Canadian history. And it's great, by the way, that we have Chuck Strahl, who's here. Chuck Strahl, my former colleague, who was the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure. Kevin Falcon, who's, of course, our Finance Minister, but was our Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure in the province of British Columbia. It's because they worked so closely together and did such a fantastic job of delivering projects for British Columbia that we saw a number of projects go forward across BC with the work of Kevin Falcon and Chuck Strahl. And we saw a number of projects go forward that saw real growth and protection of British Columbia's economy, like the new Park Ridge and Kicking Horse Canyon, like cooperation and support for the widening and rebuilding of the Sea to Sky Highway ahead of the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. We also saw the expansion and resurfacing of Highway 97 across the province. As well as going beyond that as well, not only did we invest in those roads, of course we invested in all regions of the province, including into Highway 3 in the southern interior, and roads, local roads and community projects all across the province. We also installed and rebuilt water systems and sewage systems in cities and towns all across this province. We of course invested into probably the most successful extension of rapid public transit across the country that we've seen since Expo 86 with the completion of the Canada Line and all of its stops. And of course we're working with the province as well with our full commitment to ensure that the Evergreen Rapid Transit SkyTrain extension to the northeast sector is indeed a reality. We've also invested in colleges and universities across the province of British Columbia, so we made investments into the economy. It wasn't just about roads and bridges and tunnels, and rail crossings and so on. It was also about our social and cultural infrastructure, investing into our capacity to continue to grow and to build the best minds, the best economy of tomorrow. So Simon Fraser University's Burnaby and Surrey campus expansions and growth were supported by the cooperation of our governments up at the University of Northern British Columbia, my alma mater. Go Timberwolves. They have an expanded campus there as well that is growing and attracting new students, not only new students from Prince George, people like me from the Lower Mainland who went up there, but from communities all across the north, Aboriginal communities all across the north, who finally have an opportunity to go to a world-class institution. The Northern Lights College in Dawson Creek has expanded their campus and their training center. We've also invested in airports across the province of British Columbia, like the Kamloops Airport expansion and extension that they've had there. We also supported ferry terminal expansions and growths across British Columbia, like just south here down in Tsawwassen. And of course, we've supported port expansion and growth, like Port Metro Vancouver, but also in Prince Rupert, which is really becoming a world-class container terminal, and much more than that, of course, with the years ahead. But we didn't also just invest in large ports for commercial reasons. We also invested in British Columbia for social reasons. We invested in social housing across the province, but we also invested in other places. Places very special to the quality of life of Canadians. I always have as my mantra as a member of Parliament, the job of an MP is not to always be right-wing or always be left-wing, to cling to an ideology. We have our ideology that drives us because we have a worldview, to be sure. We're very much conservative. But also our job, when we cut through it all, is to make sure that we improve the quality of life of our constituents, which is why we invest in things like improving and expanding the waterfront down in Steveston, but also making sure that we build and support the new cruise ship terminal over in Nanaimo, which will support the local economy when cruise ship season happens there. And also as Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages, which is to say the Minister for Arts and Culture, we've also invested in many things across the province of British Columbia that improve our cultural reality and support some of those institutions that are so critical to British Columbia's identity and things that we're very proud of. Projects like the expansion and growth of Vancouver Aquarium, where the Prime Minister was here to make the announcement. Bard on the Beach, which of course is fantastic. We supported the development of their new center stage. We also invested as well in the expansion of the newly renovated Science World. We've also did site protections in places like Barkerville, which of course we're so proud of as British Columbians. And also we protected great heritage buildings like the Laurel Packing House in the Cultural District in downtown Kelowna. And also we did things like we renovated an old rundown post office and turned it into the multi-purpose Calvin Clark Center for the Arts in Dawson Creek. And at this point, I would assure you this is the before picture. Our idea of the picture is a little bit more sparkly than that. But also buttressing and supporting existing institutions that are really icons of British Columbia, like the Royal BC Museum, ensuring that the Queenie Theatre continues to grow and be there as well. But then also investing in places in green spaces and parks that are so important to our identity and our quality of life in British Columbia, like Pacific Rim National Park. We did all this, yes, of course, as I say, to support the economy, but also to make sure that British Columbia is this balance of what we have, a strong economy, a strong quality of life is protected going forward. So taking together all across the country, all these investments in parks and galleries and roads and bridges and tunnels, and expansion of public transit, overpasses, ports, airports, the entire province, indeed all the provinces across the country benefited from that. And as a result of these investments, and I can tell you this as well, when we made these investments, we were very anxious, because this was $33 billion invested into the economy, one-shot investment in cooperation with the provinces. Provinces were very nimble and very hardworking, very diligent to ensure that they matched our funding as were municipalities. But we made this investment, we were very anxious. And the Auditor General, at the demand of the opposition, who were sure that there was going to be scandal associated with this, by the way, that we were going to favor some projects and not others and play politics and regional investments. The Auditor General, Sheila Fraser, in her last serious and substantive report as Auditor General before she left, she looked at our economic action plan and she reported back and there were no problems. There was no political interference. This was balanced, responsible, and it fed the Canadian economy. And as a result today, Canada has recovered all of the economic output that was lost and jobs that were lost during the recession of 2008-2009. There are about 600,000 more Canadians working today than when the recession ended, one of the strongest records amongst all the advanced countries in the world. And by the way, close to 90% of these jobs are full-time jobs, 3/4 of them in the private sector, and high-paying quality jobs that will last for many years. The gap in Canada is favored, by the way, also when it comes to the jobs question. When measured versus the United States, our unemployment rate is about 2.5% lower than that of the United States. It's the first time that that's happened in a generation. We made very different choices than other countries. But it didn't happen by accident. When we were first elected back in 2006, there was a lot of chatter, and you all know this, about the gap between expenditures and tax levels in the United States and growing concerns about the U.S. housing bubble. So we had a sense, the world had a sense, that there was a growing anxiety and problems in the global economy, which is why we prepared for this and helped prepare for 2008-2009 by lowering taxes. Lowering taxes responsibly in every way that we could. Low business taxes, corporate taxes, consumption taxes, cutting the GST by 2 points, and lowering income taxes. In fact, the tax burden that Canadians are shouldered with today is at its lowest point since 1968, the first year, of course, of Pierre Trudeau's time as Canada's Prime Minister. And also we paid down debt. When times were good, we did what all families do. We paid down our debt. And in fact, in our first year of government, we made the largest single debt pay down in Canadian history. We did this at a time when the opposition political parties were calling for not just increased, but dramatically increased government spending in virtually every area of the economy. So we reduced red tape, we made sure that tariffs and tariff changes that were made, and also we expanded free trade agreements. And I want to make this point at the risk of sounding modest. It's not too late. At the risk of sounding modest, I would like to proudly assert something that I think is quite clear, that our government is indeed the most aggressively pro-free trade government that Canada has indeed ever seen. In fact, since we formed government 6 years ago, our government has launched an ambitious free trade plan that includes increasing trade opportunities for Canadian workers and businesses. We believe in creating Canadian jobs through world sales. And that's how you think about it, by the way. Creating Canadian jobs through world sales. We've expanded free trade agreements with 8 countries: Colombia, Jordan, Panama, Peru, the European Free Trade Association, their member states of Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. Canada and China are currently negotiating a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement. Negotiations are also well underway with the European Union and India, which, taken together, an agreement with both those countries will boost the Canadian economy by roughly $18 billion. And just before Christmas, the Prime Minister announced that the Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement. Added to these trade agreements and investment agreements, Canada has also gone down the path of air liberalization in a way that has not been seen before in Canadian history. I know Larry Bird is here, and he gave a forceful argument last week about the importance of air liberalization, what it means to British Columbia, what it means to Canada. And we're trying to seize those opportunities. The great ideas that are coming from our airports and our entrepreneurial sectors are critical for British Columbia's growth. But I would take a moment to point out that since 2006, we have negotiated further liberalization and updating existing air liberalization agreements with Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, Qatar, Algeria, Egypt, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, Switzerland, El Salvador, Tunisia, Ethiopia, Morocco, Cuba, the EU, South Africa, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Turkey, the Dominican Republic, Panama, the Philippines, Barbados, Mexico, Singapore, Iceland, Jordan, Kuwait, Ireland, a little place called the United States, and another places called Croatia and Serbia. Small accomplishment, I would say. Now, in fact, taken together, we have concluded bilateral air agreements with 86 foreign countries and territories, including all 27 EU member states, and we are considering air agreement negotiations with other countries and territories in pretty much every region of the world. We achieved all this, by the way, at a time, and this is the important thing. It's not just that but we achieved these things at a time when protectionists were on the march. We heard protectionists from everywhere. You see it in the United States, you see it in Europe, you see it in Canada, where protectionists are on the march and say it's time to roll back and to go within our economy and to not reach out to the world. They're wrong. By the way, arguing with the Democrats on the concept of comparative and competitive advantage, I said this is funny. Arguing with the Democrats about the concept of comparative and competitive advantage, how Canada benefits from trade with the world, it really is like arguing with somebody who believes that professional wrestling is real. You can't break through. It's just a wall that you will not break through. So rather than trying to win the argument, you just beat them and you move forward and you continue to build. So through all these actions taken together, in order, first we had early debt pay downs in the former government when times were good, to create the fiscal room to support the Canadian economy. Next, we had unprecedented tax relief across the Canadian economy to spur investment in economic activity. Third, we had unprecedented investment in infrastructure projects all across the country to protect the Canadian economy from the worst of the recession. And our economic action plan did indeed deliver the protection to Canadians that we were looking for. And the world has noticed. The world's noticed that they're speaking out. For the 4th year in a row, the World Economic Forum rates our banking system as the world's soundest. 5 Canadian financial institutions were named to Bloomberg's list of the world's strongest banks, more than any other country in the world. Both the IMF and the OECD forecast that Canada will have among the strongest economic growth records in the G7 in the years ahead. Forbes magazine has ranked Canada as number one in its annual look at the best countries in the world in which to do business. And recently, 3 credit rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch and Standard & Poor's, affirmed their top ratings for Canada's economy. And this is all very well and good, and we can stand here and take credit for this. But the reality is we need to move forward because, as we all know, that we have new challenges that are indeed staring us right in the face. The most immediate issue, as you all know, is Europe, where concrete actions are still clearly needed to deal with the sovereign debt and banking sector crises. This pressing problem threatens not only Europe itself, but indeed the balance of growth between all G20 countries that have made their priority growth since the global recession first started. Ongoing uncertainty stemming from the European sovereign banking crisis is leading to a broader instability outside the European global credit markets as well. And these are things that we have to address, which is why just this past week, the Prime Minister of the World Economic Forum in Davos made the case for more responsible and aggressive action to deal with the continuing debt problems in the global economy. And being a leader, you of course have to lead by action. You can't ask others to do things that you're not prepared to do yourself, which is why our government is going to be leading by action. As I said, in good times, we've paid down our debt and lower taxes to protect us and give us the fiscal room to take action, but also to spur the Canadian economy in directions that we needed to go. And as a result of that, at times we had the room to respond when we needed to. So because we paid down this debt, long before the crisis of 2009, we were able to keep our net debt to GDP ratio well below the G7 counterparts, while other nations were piling on vast amounts of new debt on top of their old debt. The IMF projects that Canada's net debt to GDP ratio is at 34.9%. That's for all governments in Canada, by the way, not just the federal government. In contrast, Germany is projected to be at 57.2%. The United States at 72.6%. The United Kingdom at 72.9%. France at 81%. Italy at 100%. The G7 average of net debt to GDP ratio this year is 80%. 80%. And again, Canada is at 34.9%. And while Kevin Falcon is in the room, I point out British Columbia is at 15%. So, just a brief word about Canada's, our position and our threats and where we're going ahead. Our economic stability did not originate, the threats to our economic stability didn't begin within our shores, but they are there and they are real, and the economic leadership that we've shown has given us this kind of flexibility. But we need to move forward, and we stand ready to respond again, as we did with the Economic Action Plan, in a flexible way if we need to, if the economy continues to have challenges that cannot be solved. But we must always remember that we will only hold on to our economic advantages by continuing to pursue those policies and arrangements that have made us so resilient in the first place: responsibility, discipline, and determination. We face repeated calls from some corners to betray those principles, to increase spending where we don't need to and where we can't. And if we listen to them, we would all see that the progress that we've created so far, it would indeed vanish. And while we act as necessary, we will always ensure that the government spending is targeted and effective. We will not, and taxpayers will not, tolerate wasting their money on inefficient, wasteful spending and programs that don't serve our social or economic well-being. And that's why the next phase of Canada's Economic Action Plan and our upcoming budget will have a clear and necessary goal of returning to balanced budgets in the medium term, but on an achievable strategy that will get us there. Ensuring that money is spent effectively, invested responsibly, and ensuring that wasteful spending is indeed eliminated is, of course, common sense. We do it in our daily lives. And it's what you do with your businesses, it's what we do with our families. So governments need to apply those simple basic rules to ourselves, and we will be when we table our budgets this spring. We need to keep Canada on a fiscally sustainable track by sticking to our target of eliminating the deficit in the medium term and finding savings within government operations. We will follow through on our pledge to balance the budget while focusing on what indeed truly matters to Canadians: our quality of life, our jobs, and our continued economic growth. We think this is a balanced approach, we think it's the right approach, and we need to keep going forward. But also, of course, means reining in government spending so that we can eliminate the deficit in the medium term and by keeping our economic advantage. So here, by the way, I'm talking about not just the federal government, but all governments, provincial and municipal governments as well, working hand in hand. And Kevin Falcon has shown extraordinary leadership in the province of British Columbia in his agenda to do so. And of course, we encourage all provinces to continue along that path. So as we prepare for Budget 2012, it's not time for dangerous, risky, and unnecessary spending projects. We need to make sure that we maintain our discipline so we can maintain our advantage. But the global economic angst will not sidetrack us from this goal, because Canada is, in fact, better positioned than any other country in the G7, and the resilience that we've demonstrated will continue to be our advantage going forward. But I also want to talk about some of the things that we're doing beyond that. It's not just about coming to a balanced budget and focused spending, but also some of the other policy initiatives that we've had. We talked about the past, where we've come from, what we did in the beginning, dealing with the crisis, where we're standing now, and where we go forward, and what we plan to do with that. And to take advantage, of course, of the economic advantages that we have. Recently, as you know, Prime Minister Harper and our Finance Minister, Jim Flaherty, committed to long-term, unprecedented, stable funding for Canada's healthcare system. We are extending the 2004 and 2014 health reports by 2 more years with the provinces, and we will be providing long-term funding increases over time, twinned with our economic output thereafter. This is the stable, sustained, long-term healthcare fund that we promised in the past, that we were elected to deliver, and the provinces have been asking for. And indeed, more than that, just this past week in Washington, D.C., our government signed with the United States a 2-year extension of the successful Canada-U.S. softwood lumber agreement, which is obviously critical for British Columbia, given it's our largest and most important industry. On the infrastructure side, in our most recent budget, we made unprecedented funding for local infrastructure permanent. So it wasn't just the stimulus cash, but on an ongoing basis. We transferred the gas tax dollars to municipalities so that local governments can make local decisions about local priorities. For years, this was the number one ask of the federal government by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Union of BC Municipalities, which was just simply, don't make us go to you and ask for money for what we think is important. Let us make our own decisions with our own money. And we delivered on that in the most recent budget. We delivered on that, and we think it's an important step forward for British Columbia. On another front, another industry, of course, that's critical to BC's long-term future. As you know, we successfully concluded the largest procurement in Canadian history, our national shipbuilding strategy. This is a $33 billion investment into the Canadian economy, and it has been praised for its objectivity, for its sound management, and in the long term will be seen as a boost to the Canadian economy at a critical time when we get our recovery from the recession. British Columbians will see thousands of direct and indirect jobs in high-paying sectors, including over at C-SPAN. I want to congratulate C-SPAN for their successful bid in receiving over $8 billion in new business to British Columbia for their shipyards in British Columbia. To support as well, on another front, our continued growth and investment into Canada, into the digital economy. We are moving forward with our copyright legislation, our Copyright Modernization Act. This legislation provides a modern intellectual property rights regime for Canadians to ensure that those who are investing thousands and sometimes millions of dollars in intellectual property in Canada are protected from those who would steal from them. We provide certainty to consumers, and certainty to creators, and will increase our capacity for investment in the Canadian economy. On another front, Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver was in British Columbia just this past week, announcing again our intentions, now that we have a majority government, to move forward with the modernization of Canada's environmental review process and approval process to protect our environment while at the same time ensuring that we have sustained investment in Canada's energy sector. This has long been a demand of Western Canadian premiers, and Premier Clark, Premier Redford, Premier Wall have all asked for this, and we will be delivering on legislation on this in the near future. And on the continued trade liberalization front, with a successful, this is very important to understand in the global context. Once we pass copyright legislation, we've had 7 rounds of negotiations on a Canada-EU free trade agreement. Once Canada adopts a Canada-EU free trade agreement, we will be truly unique in a trade liberalization sense as a country. At that point, when adopted, Canada will be the only country in the world with a trade liberalization agreement with the 2 largest economies in the world, the United States and Europe. So we stand to gain tremendously from this agreement. But we can't stop there. We'll take advantage of our historic and our lineage and our roots to Europe and the economy of Europe. We take advantage of the most successful trading relationship with the United States, the most successful trading relationship the world has ever seen. But of course, for us in the West, continuing to look west is critical for Canada. Next week, Prime Minister Harper will be in China for a full week with our Ministers of Trade, Finance, Foreign Affairs, Industry, Natural Resources, and others to pursue greater economic opportunities for Canada in China. Our government has had more ministerial visits to China than any government in Canada's history, and our trade relationship is on track and is indeed growing. Thanks to this persistent effort and push by Vancouver's business community, listened to by our government, and delivered by our Prime Minister, we have seen incredible growth between our relationship with China. We have witnessed the growth where our exports have surged by 69.6% over the past half-decade. China is now Canada is the second largest merchandise trading partner and our third largest export market. And this past year, for the first time in our history as British Columbians, China became the largest export market for British Columbia, surpassing the United States for the first time in our province's history. And this trend will continue across all of our western provinces, so to take advantage of this is something that is critical. British Columbia's wood exports to China were up from $23 million in 2001 to $794 million in 2010. We exported a record 4.5 million cubic meters of softwood lumber products to China in 2010, up 76.8% over 2009. And this growth continues to surge. June of this past year saw a record-breaking month for BC softwood lumber exports to China, with over 824,000 cubic meters exported. That's up 183.6% over volume at the same time the year before. From January to July of this past year, BC exported 4.2 million cubic meters to China, up over double from the previous year, in both volume and importantly in value. And trade with other Asian countries is important to expand as well, including India and South Korea. Trade between India and Canada is up 73% since 2004, with exports increasing over 140% over the same time period. And as positive and as encouraging as these trends are, we know that we must do more. From the Hudson Bay Company through FTA, NAFTA, and now the Asia Pacific Trade Agreement, Canada always has been and always will be a trading nation. Taking our obligations to continue to expand our opportunities in markets is critical. Today, over 60% of Canada's GDP is tied to our trade arrangements, and building on our successes, we will continue to push forward with trade liberalization in markets and market expansion in the coming months in China, in South Korea, in India, in Vietnam, and indeed elsewhere. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, our government has a very aggressive agenda ahead of us. Canadians entrusted us with the majority government, and we plan to use it. Jobs, fiscal prudence, economic growth, these are the priorities of Canadians. Canada has been a leader throughout our response to the global economic turndown, and we will remain a leader. If we strive for an enduring economic prosperity, not a fleeting short-term political victory, we will indeed be leaving a legacy that we will be very proud of for our children and grandchildren for many generations to come. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today and to give you a feel of what our government is doing. I think it's indeed a very proud time to be Canadians, and if we have a majority government, we are using it, and Canada will be the stronger for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Minister, for your inspiring words and for the tremendous support and the drive that you brought to the economy and the jobs fund. Now it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a question, please hold up your blue cards and our staff will collect them. Perhaps I can start asking a question on behalf of the Board of Trade's Economic Development Committee. Beyond the border, the recent bilateral accord between the United States and Canada is set to incite economic growth, strengthen our trading relationship, and spur job creation through increased movement between borders. Nonetheless, critics have responded to this agreement with apprehension regarding harmonizing product and safety rules, as well as privacy concerns related to the sharing of intelligence. How would you respond to opponents who fear the loss of Canadian sovereignty in exchange for increased access to the American market?
Thank you very much. On the product safety side, it's the Canadian standard to which others are frankly rising. With regard to the privacy side, the Privacy Commissioner raised these concerns prior to the announcement of our deal. We took the Privacy Commissioner's concerns and apprehensions seriously. They were raised in the House of Commons. We've talked about them. They've been integrated, and you'll note that again, as is often the case, before you enter into something, people spill out all of their anxieties, and you triage them, you address them, and focus on them. You cut away the serious concerns from the legitimate ones. And since then, the Privacy Commissioner has been quite clear that the border agreement between Canada and the United States protects our and ensures that cross-border traffic will continue to grow. I do find it interesting, by the way. I have to say, I'm a politician, so I'm really political for a minute. But I do find it interesting that at the same time, it often shows you how ideology will trump common sense. The Privacy Commissioner raises concerns about the government collecting data and letting others have access to it for reasons for which it was not intended. We address those concerns, we sign the border agreement, we move forward. The Privacy Commissioner has been silent, the opposition has been silent, the media gets it, things are fine. Yet when we campaign in 2000, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2011, 3 of those 5 campaigns we were successful elected into government, this time elected into a majority government, saying we would get rid of the long gun registry because it's a misallocation of scarce resources to make sure that our streets are safe. And we say we're actually going to get rid of the long gun registry, which means also getting rid of the data because the government has collected that information for the purposes of the long gun registry that doesn't work. But the opposition parties say, no, save that data and scatter it around to other levels of government that might want to use that data for their own justice purposes. The government, when it collects data for specific purposes, has to protect and safeguard that information. And we decide not to use that information for those purposes. We have an obligation to protect the privacy and decency of Canadians, not to abuse that trust with that information, and to actually get rid of the long gun registry. So we have these voices in the House of Commons who are arguing against themselves on these issues, but we've been consistent. Protect the privacy of Canadians in commerce when you travel to the United States, and also protect the privacy and decency of everyday Canadians, that when we collect information for certain purposes, it will be used for those purposes, and if not, that information needs to be removed so we can protect decency and privacy of Canadians.
Minister, your government has introduced pooled registered pension plan legislation that will provide opportunities to those 60% of Canadians who do not have a workplace pension. I've heard others say that increasing the CPP would be a better option. What are your thoughts? Kate from Central One.
I'll break it down simply this way. The pooled pension plan proposal is our proposal. The CPP proposal is the NDP proposal. Ours is better. We put forward the legislation. It's being debated in Parliament right now. We'll go to the Finance Committee for greater scrutiny and address it, but we think it's the balanced and responsible way. I do find it, again, as well, always amusing that people don't, the opposition, I should say, don't understand the interconnectedness of these issues. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board invests across the Canadian economy. I believe it's 22%. It's over 20% of the CPP's investments are actually into Canada's energy sector, into principally the province, of course, of Alberta. Invested in the energy sector, so you have the official opposition in the House of Commons saying the only thing that can save our retirement system for those who are most vulnerable is to ensure that we increase CPP payouts to 10, 12, 14, 16,000 in the out years. And we should do that. And we should do that when we've got to make sure that corporations are not coming out of control. We've got to shut down the pipelines. We've got to shut down the energy. We've got to shut down the tar sands. That's what the Canada Pension Plan is invested in. So we need to make sure that the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board has its sovereignty and its independence. You don't have Parliament barking at it. That they continue to invest and have that social safety net. We believe in the activism of Bismarck and Disraeli, 2 European conservatives who believe in the establishment of the ethic of common provision for everyday citizens, because it was believed then, and it was believed now by conservatives, that the public will not tolerate the growth of the free market unless we ensure that those who are the most vulnerable in our society aren't brought along with to ensure that we have with the social safety net that ensures their quality of life and standard of living. Which is why we're moving forward to protect the CPP, protect the Southwest, protect our seniors, in buttressing and protecting the OAS to make sure it's there not only for current retirees, future retirees, and retirees who are not yet born. We want to make sure all these things are safe. But the only way to make those things safe is to generate the economic growth that spins off the revenues to support our social system. And that's a balance that only our governments are arguing for in the House of Commons.
Your government recently held a summit with Aboriginal leaders in Ottawa around on-reserve issues such as Hoekstra. What most Canadians don't know is that the majority of Aboriginals, 70% in Canada, live in urban settings in BC. Does your government have any plans to formally engage the urban Aboriginal community? David Isaac.
Yeah, we do, and we are. I mentioned I was a student at the University of North British Columbia. And that, by the way, it's a very interesting sort of, for lack of a softer word, it's a good test market for the kind of policies that work. The city of Prince George, 85,000 to 90,000 people. You have a new university that's growing and building. You have resource sector jobs that are there. And then you have Aboriginal communities that, for the first time, actually have access to world-class universities. The largest Native Friendship Center in the entire country is in the city of Prince George. It's on 5th Avenue. It's massive. It's a converted office building. And it's the largest Native Friendship Center in the entire country. And it's received stable funding over years, hasn't had a dime of cuts. There's always arguments for increasing the spending, of course. And it's because of these Aboriginal Friendship Centers across the country that some kids who maybe come from very, very difficult circumstances, very, very difficult family circumstances, the problem of geography, the problem of climate, where they can't get to and from their hometown or from their reserves to get to and from school without actually having an affordable place in which to stay while they actually try to study in a world-class institution. And so we have these Native Friendship Centers across the country, and Prince George is a fantastic example where I would be willing to wager that probably half of the Aboriginal student body at the University of Northern BC wouldn't have the opportunity to go to university, to have greater opportunities in life without that investment in those kinds of friendship centers. And those success stories are all across the country. So you need to find those success stories, build them, rebuild them, and make sure they're repeated, but also find the places where money is not being spent as efficiently and reallocated. But certainly urban Aboriginal strategies is acute in British Columbia, it's acute in Western Canada, and so we want to have ongoing engagement and investment to find the success stories and to duplicate them. But as you can appreciate, it's an area of great concern. And we do want to make sure that the entire Aboriginal conversation across the country is not just supplementing vocabulary of on-reserve support, which is the federal government's responsibility, while turning a blind eye to all the pretty often extraordinary and tragic circumstances of those who are suffering off reserve.
Time for one more question, Minister. When financial decisions are being made, can the cultural and heritage sectors depend on the Minister to be an advocate for sustained funding for our industries within Cabinet and to speak to the role they play in job creation and economic stimulation? Canada TIVS, Vancouver International Writers Festival.
I thought you were going to ask me Giants and Patriots. Indeed. Yeah, I'm very proud of it. I'll keep this short so everybody has the rest of the day to get onto. But it gives me an opportunity to say something I try to say in every single speech, and you almost probably not having said it here. Canada's arts and culture sector is $46 billion in the Canadian economy. It represents over 600,000 jobs in the Canadian economy, by the way. It's 3 times the size of Canada's insurance industry. It's twice the size of Canada's forest industry. Any government who says they have a plan for economic recovery that doesn't include a plan for investment in arts and culture, the government doesn't have a plan for economic recovery. We're the only country in the world, with our economic action plan, as I described, that made the decision not to cut funding for culture, not to maintain, but to increase funding for arts and culture. The only government in the world that has done so. We've increased funding for the Canada Council for the Arts by 20%. We created two new national museums in the dearth of the recession. 2 new national museums outside of the national capital, so that Canadians can have access to our cultural institutions, not just in downtown Ottawa, but beyond that. We've invested unprecedented amounts into arts and culture with the benefit being seen all across the country. And I've taken a personal upon myself as the minister responsible for arts and culture for the government of Canada to drive home not only the message, but just to try to show leadership. I'll give you a small example. On Monday night, this coming Monday night at the National Arts Centre. National Arts Centre, by the way, the National Arts Centre has been celebrating this year, I think its 42nd year in existence. Even though with the recession, this past year, they just made their annual report in Parliament. This past year had their 2nd best fundraising year ever in their history, because Canadians understood that when cultural organizations get in trouble and they go south, it creates not only a side effect of a recession, but then you also have a psychological recession that's much more difficult to come back from. So supporting arts and culture is something that was seen as so important. But they had their 2nd best fundraising year ever in the last year as we're coming out of the recession. On Monday night at the National Arts Centre, it's a great story. Monsieur Lazare, if you haven't seen this movie, you should. Monsieur Lazare is Canada's Oscar-nominated film. In a week and a half, it's going to be there to get the Academy Awards. Philippe Talango is the director of it. And at the National Arts Centre, a francophone film shot entirely in the province of Quebec. The National Arts Centre has a theater in which we show our movie nights. It's my 6th movie night that I've sponsored. No taxpayer money goes to it. It's all funded from the inside. Private sector support for the arts critical. And it's an 800-seat theater. We have 975 people RSVP. 90% of them Anglophones to come and see a francophone movie in downtown Ottawa to support a movie by a guy, Philippe Talango, who got his first paycheck in the arts at the National Arts Centre as an usher. And here he is 20 years later coming back to the National Arts Centre with this Oscar-nominated film. And when he comes up, he doesn't know this yet, but when he comes up on stage, we're going to have all the current ushers applauding him as he comes to the stage, welcoming him back to the National Arts Centre with this Oscar-nominated film as we wish him well as he goes to the Oscars. Canada from Michael, Sarah, as a matter of fact, December, right before Christmas, December of last year, 4 of the top 5 U.S. Billboard charting artists were all Canadians. The top selling comic in the world, Russell Peters, is Canadian. some of the best artists in the world, all Canadian. Some of the most talked about actors in the United States are Canadian. Ryan Reynolds, all Canadians. We are punching way above our weight in the cultural sector. Something to be proud of, and it's something we're going to continue to support.